Part 48. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 471. At this time, after Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, his face was slightly happy. Don't worry, as long as I take action, I can guarantee that this guy will be captured. After Lin Yu heard Bai Hu say this, he nodded gently, and then with a thought in his mind, Bai Hu appeared directly in front of everyone. At this time, when the white tiger appeared, Su Yang and Su Weiner were stunned when they saw the huge white tiger. At this time, the two of them looked at each other like this: you look at me, I look at. Looking at the corners of your eyes and brows, there is a look of complete disbelief. How is this possible? This white tiger is a bit too scary. Even if our two Tao beasts are combined, we may not be the opponent of the white tiger in front of us. Su Yang nodded slightly. That's right, this white tiger is indeed terrifying. It's really giving me a headache. It's a headache. At this time, after seeing this scene, Count Nicholas' brows seemed to be knitted together. Bai Hu, how could you own a white tiger? How is this possible? This is absolutely impossible. Count Nicholas' eyes were staring directly at Su Yang, and at this moment, Su Yang was staring at Count Nicholas with a smile on his face, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became even more intense. Became obvious. Nothing is impossible. Among all the things you think are impossible, for me, everything is actually possible. Su Yang spoke unhurriedly like this, with a slight sneer on the corners of his mouth, and a kind of contempt and disdain in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after seeing this scene, Count Nicholas' pupils suddenly enlarged, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was even more awe-inspiring at this time. Boy, I don't care who you pretend to be in front of me, but if you dare to pretend like this in front of me, then I'm afraid I will have to say sorry to you. A gloomy look flashed through Count Nicholas's eyes, and the murderous intention in his body was even more awe-inspiring at this moment. A cold aura spread out from his body, and that moment a cold aura made everyone feel a strong sense of oppression. Even Su Yang himself couldn't help but suddenly condensed on his face after feeling the cold aura. After waiting for a while, Su Yang seemed to understand something and just sat cross-legged. At this time, the corner of Bai Hu's mouth only evoked a faint smile, and the smile on his face became more and more obvious. At this time, after Lin Yu saw this scene, his expression could not help but suddenly condensed, and finally he rolled his eyes at Bai Hu angrily. I'm really unhappy with this guy. How about I slap him? Lin Yu just said this unhurriedly, with a hint of a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, a bit of joking flashed in his eyes, and a bit of murderous intent on his body. Even more awe-inspiring. At this time, after Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, a strange color flashed across his face, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and his eyes stared straight at him. He stared at Lin Yu. But this big guy doesn't seem to be that easy to deal with. Bai Hu said this leisurely to Lin Yu, and at this time, Lin Yu rolled his eyes at Bai Hu angrily, and then waved casually. It seems difficult to deal with, but I believe in your strength. If you can't even deal with this trash with your strength, then I'm afraid you won't be able to use it in the future. At this time, 3 black lines appeared on Bai Hu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Bai Hu's eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. But this. Nothing to worry about, go quickly, I believe you. After Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, 3 black lines appeared on the huge tiger's head, and he was speechless for a while. At this time, Bai Hu thought to himself, you believe me, but I myself I don't even believe in myself. Lin Yu just turned around and glared fiercely at Bai Hu. At this time, Bai Hu was also on the verge of crying for a while. After a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, he straightened his face forward. Rush away. The speed of the white tiger was extremely strange. It took only a moment for him to arrive in front of that guy. Then in the blink of an eye, the white tiger raised its huge claws towards the guy. And just slapped it over. After Count Nicholas saw this scene, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and there was a sense of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. However, after seeing this scene, Count Nicholas was full of unwillingness, but he did not show any sign of it. A little bit of a way to deal with it. Count Nicholas forcibly twisted his body into an extremely strange confusion, and then suddenly turned sideways. The speed of Count Nicholas was extremely fast. He dodged the attack of the white tiger in just a moment, and then he suddenly turned around and kicked the white tiger in the abdomen. After a moment, Nicholas's face suddenly froze, and then he suddenly pulled back and fell back straight. In the end, Nicholas stood still, his eyes fixed on the guy in front of him. At this time, the strong and condensed sense of oppression emanating from the white tiger made Nicholas' face suddenly startled. At this time, the white tiger suddenly opened its bloody mouth and bit Nicholas. When Nicholas felt the strong sense of oppression from the white tiger, his face suddenly sank. After waiting for a while, Behu seemed to suddenly remember something. His face suddenly twisted and his expression darkened slightly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 472. At this time, after Nicholas felt the terrifying oppression on the white tiger's body, his face instantly became ugly, and then his face soon seemed to be twisted together. What do you want to do? I'm warning you, you're the best, the best. At this time, Nicholas's tone of speech was a little incoherent, and at this moment, the white tiger suddenly rushed towards Nicholas. His speed was extremely fast, just in one breath had already arrived in front of Nicholas. Then he saw the white tiger next to him, waving his huge tiger claws, and suddenly swatted towards Nicholas. The speed of this white tiger was so fast that it even drew an afterimage in the void. With just one breath, the huge tiger claws were already in front of Nicholas. At this time, Behu was staring at Count Nicholas with a smile on his face, a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of ridicule in his eyes. Boy, I'll give you a chance today to die obediently. If not, then don't blame me for being rude to you. After hearing what Behu said, Count Nicholas's face instantly turned ugly. A bit of gloom flashed across his face, and the murderous intent on his body was even more awe-inspiring. At this time, Behu also had a faint smile on his lips, and there was a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and brows. After waiting for a while, a mysterious aura emanated from Behu's body. At this time, after Behu felt this aura, his whole face also condensed slightly. And just a moment later, Behu seemed to suddenly remember something. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a gloomy meaning. After a moment, there was a feeling of suspense. Rising quietly like this. After Count Nicholas felt this glorious aura, his face instantly became ugly. A bit of solemnity flashed in his eyes, and his eyes stared directly at Behu's. On the body. Boy, what do you mean? After Behu heard what Count Nicholas said, the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a look of contempt and disdain. Don't you know what I mean? Behu just said this unhurriedly. At this time, after seeing this scene, Count Nicholas couldn't help but clenched his fists, and the murderous intention in his body started to surge. I'm really not sure. Count Nicholas quietly activated his own power, and a surging power emitted from Count Nicholas. After Earl Nicholas felt this surging power, his face tightened slightly, and he suddenly had a somewhat ominous premonition in his heart. After a while, the two people looked at each other like this. A burst of fierce sparks burst out in the void, and the air between the two of them seemed to be frozen. And after waiting for this moment, a cloud of mist suddenly rose up, giving people a mysterious feeling. And at this moment, a light blue breath in the distance suddenly rose into the sky, and the breath soared into the sky, straight into the sky. After seeing this scene, Count Nicholas couldn't hide the joy on his face at that time. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with excitement, and then he laughed like this. The whole person was completely in a state of madness. At this time, Baihu and Lin Yu looked at each other with a certain solemnity in their eyes. Almost in the same breath, a jet-black aura sank directly into the body of Count Nicholas. At this moment, after Count Nicholas felt this aura, he couldn't help but look up to the sky and laugh wildly, with the corners of his eyes. There is a complete sense of madness in the eyebrows. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes. His eyes were fixed on Count Nicholas, and his expression darkened slightly at that time. Interesting. It's really interesting. It looks like you have someone helping you. At this time, Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. After Count Nicholas saw this scene, after waiting for a while, he half closed his eyes as if he suddenly remembered something. Little guy, no matter what happens today, you will definitely die. The white tiger is indeed naturally restrained towards me, but after gaining the power of an adult, he is just a mere white tiger. If he wants to hurt me, it will be as difficult as climbing to the sky. Earl Nicholas spoke unhurriedly like this, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious and rampant. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes, and then he glared coldly at Count Nicholas. From the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, this completely revealed a kind of the gloomy color. Since you want to seek death, it would be really unjustifiable if I don't help you. Today I will let you know what the price is. Lin Yu's voice was rather gloomy and hoarse. At this time, Count Nicholas just glanced at Baihu coldly, with a kind of disdain in the corners of his eyes and brows. Only for this little kitty? You deserve it. Count Nicholas spoke in a leisurely manner, but there was no way to hide the contempt in his eyes. And just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to remember something. There are some things that cannot be turned back. Since you have to seek death, you can't make excuses if you don't succeed. Count Nicholas just smiled slightly, with a gloomy look in his eyes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 473. And at this moment, a lingering aura rose up from the bodies of the two people. After a moment, a sword energy suddenly rose into the sky, and then in the blink of an eye, above the world, above the sky. After waiting for a while, Lin Yu stood firm like this. His father narrowed his eyes. At this moment, he saw an ancient blade suddenly appearing in Count Nicholas' hand. At this time, Lin Yu half closed his eyes, staring directly at Count Nicholas. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a flash of light flashed between his eyes and eyebrows. A bit of mockery. After waiting for a while, Count Nicholas suddenly moved him, swung the bone blade in his hand, and suddenly pointed it towards Lin Yu's face, holding the ancient town with both hands to split Huashan Mountain with all his strength. With such a posture, he suddenly started to strike towards Lin Yu crazily. Count Nicholas's speed was extremely fast. In just one breath, he had already arrived in front of Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu did not dodge, but stood straight on the spot, with more words at the corners of his mouth. It evoked a faint smile, and there was a completely mocking look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, the white tiger suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu, and Count Nicholas was directly thrown away by the white tiger's claws. Lin Yu's lips curved into a mocking smile. It's just a small skill, but you actually dare to do the same thing. If I don't kill you today, I'm afraid you really don't know how many eyes this Lord Ma has. Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, Count Nicholas was staring directly at Lin Yu, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. Very good, boy, today I have to let you see what Lord Ma's three eyes are. The smile on Count Nicholas's face began to become more and more ferocious. At this time, after Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. A bit of contempt flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and a bit of a sneer appeared in the corners of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting. If you don't want to live today, then I'll make it happen for you. As soon as Lin Yu finished speaking, he rushed straight towards Count Nicholas. His speed was extremely fast, and he was in front of Lin Yu almost in an instant. At this time, Count Nicholas held the ancient blade tightly with both hands. When Lin Yu came to him, Count Nicholas disappeared out of thin air. Then Lin Yu heard an evil figure behind him. The sound sounded just like that suddenly. Little guy, if you want to die today, I'll make it happen for you. Lin Yu's face suddenly darkened, and in his heart at that time, a bit of surprise suddenly flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. How is it possible? When did this guy suddenly come behind me? At this time, Lin Yu also felt a wave of turmoil in his heart, and a somewhat ominous premonition suddenly emerged in his heart at this moment. And at this moment, the smile on the corner of Count Nicholas's mouth became more and more obvious and rampant. Ha ha ha, little guy, there are still many things you don't know, and there are even more things you can't think of. It's better to die and I will give you a happy one. Ha 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 ha. At this time, I saw that the ancient man was about to come to Lin Yu's back, and then two rays of light, one black and one white, shot up straight away. The speed of those two rays of light was extremely strange, and it was just a moment. Already arrived in front of Count Nicholas. When Count Nicholas saw the scene again, his face was also shocked. At this time, he quickly escaped and retreated suddenly towards the back. At this moment, Lin Yu also had a faint smile on his lips. Su Yang and Su Weiner just turned their heads and glanced at Lin Yu, with a few meaningful smiles on their lips. How are you, Mr. Lin? Lin Yu heard it at this time. After the two of them finished speaking, they just waved their hands casually and smiled. It doesn't matter, it's just such a waste, I can still handle it. Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly. At this time, Su Yang and Su Weiner couldn't help but smile slightly after hearing what Lin Yu said, and then nodded lightly. It's okay if you're okay, it's okay if you're okay. Lin Yu was like this at this time. He suddenly became smaller. At this time, he seemed to have suddenly remembered something. Then he turned his head and glanced towards Baihu. Lin Yu was a little curious about Baihu, what happened just now. And when he turned his head and glanced at Baihu, his face suddenly became ugly, and there was a solemn expression in the corners of his eyes and brows. What happened to you just now? Why didn't you come and help me? At this time, Baihu also became slightly distracted for an instant. Baihu turned his head, glanced at Lin Yu, and then sighed heavily. There was a complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. I don't know exactly what happened just now, but I just felt like my mind was lost for a while, and I couldn't remember what happened right away. Baihu said quietly like this. Just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to have remembered something. A bit of excitement flashed in his eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. I see. If I guessed correctly, it should be a domain illusion. The domain illusion is full of blood and energy. Those who are trapped in the illusion are still unconscious, but they are in danger of their lives. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 474. At this time, Lin Yu thought of this, and then slowly raised his head, and glanced coldly at Count Nicholas, and the corner of his mouth evoked a bit of vagueness. Smiling, there was even a hint of mockery in his eyes. It seems that no one came to help you just now. That blood energy is just the result of you integrating the power of the domain. I'm right. Lin Yu just spoke in a leisurely manner, with a faint smile on the corner of his mouth. His eyes were fixed on Count Nicholas, and the smile on the corner of his mouth was the sneer became more and more obvious. At this time, after seeing Lin Yu like this, Count Nicholas's face suddenly sank, and his eyes were full of murderous intent. Boy, even if you understand now, what is going on? Don't forget, you are already in my domain now. I'm afraid you won't be able to do anything even if you know it. I can't. Count Nicholas just said this unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and the corners of his eyes and brows were full of mockery. And just after this moment, a lingering breath suddenly rose up, and then the breath spiraled directly up, and a cold momentum suddenly came from Count Nicholas exudes this. The overwhelming momentum made everyone tremble. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but subconsciously took a few steps back and stared at this person with a vigilant expression. On Count Nicholas. At this time, Lin Yu was rapidly thinking about how he should deal with Count Nicholas next. At this moment, the voice of the space-time beast suddenly sounded in Lin Yu's mind. If I were to come, I might be able to break through this space barrier, and then a few of us might be able to get out of this guy's space. The space-time beast said this unhurriedly. After Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, a bitter smile appeared on the corners of his mouth, and a helpless expression was revealed in the corners of his eyes and brows. Do you think I don't want to? But don't think about it. I don't have any spiritual power in my body now to summon you. After Lin Yu thought of this, the bitter smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious, his eyes were full of helplessness, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the time and space beast's expression also condensed slightly, and at this time, the white tiger was whistling at the side. Lin Yu rolled his eyes at Baihu angrily, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. Now think of a solution quickly, otherwise, we may all have to die here. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Baihu's expression also condensed slightly, and his eyes evoked a strange light. After hesitating for a moment, Baihu seemed to have remembered something. Maybe there's a way. After Lin Yu heard Baihu say this, he also showed a look of joy. Hurry up and tell me what you can do. Baihu just stared at Lin Yu with a smile. If I have enough spiritual power, I should be able to forcibly break through the space barrier. At this time, 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He glanced coldly at Baihu angrily. I do know that you may have a chance, but do you think that if I have enough spiritual power, why not summon the space-time beast? At this time, when Baihu heard what Lin Yu said, he was slightly startled, and then he laughed like this. Hey, how could I forget this matter? You don't seem to have any spiritual power now. At this time, Count Nicholas on the side turned into bloodstains all over the sky. At this time, he didn't even bother to pretend. His eyes were staring directly at Baihu and Lin Yu. The corner of his mouth, that bit of sneer, became more and more obvious. Little guy, if you don't die today, my heart will be uneasy. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of helplessness, and then he shook his head. Really? Don't you think you will be able to defeat me now? Lin Yu just spoke unhurriedly, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, Count Nicholas couldn't help being slightly surprised when he saw Lin Yu looking so confident. Boy, stop pretending here, I really don't believe there is anything you can do to defeat me. Count Nicholas's tone became colder and colder at the end, and then the mass of blood suddenly wrapped around Lin Yu. At this time, the blood in the sky carried a strong smell of blood, which made people even feel a little faintly nauseous. Of course, Lin Yu felt the same way at this time, but at this time, he forcibly twisted his body into a very strange arc, and then immediately turned around, jumped up, and stood straight with one kick. He kicked Count Nicholas on the chest. At this time, Count Nicholas' body seemed to be completely atomized, and Lin Yu's kick went directly through Count Nicholas' chest. At this time, Lin Yu's face began to look slightly ugly after seeing this scene. There was a bit of solemnity in the corners of his eyes and brows, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. How is that possible? This is probably a bit too scary. At this time, Lin Yu was murmuring in a low voice, with a solemn look in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. Count Nicholas stared at Lin Yu with a smile, his eyes full of mockery, and then he gently spread his hands. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 475. Oh, it seems like you can't deal with me this time. In fact, I still admire you quite a bit. Let me give you a chance. Kneel down and admit your mistake obediently. I may not know how I feel when the time comes. Once it's done, I'll let you live. Earl Nicholas spoke unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and there was a completely cold look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after hearing what Count Nicholas said, Lin Yu only had a mocking smile on his lips, and there was a look of contempt in the corners of his eyes and brows. Let me live? Ha ha ha, interesting, it's so interesting. I'm really afraid that you will kill me. That really scares me to death. Lin Yu stared at Count Nicholas with a smile on his face, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Count Nicholas felt a wave of emotion on his body. A killing intent suddenly rose up. Boy, since you don't have to drink wine as a penalty for toasting, I'll make it happen for you today. After Count Nicholas finished speaking, he suddenly started to wrap things up towards Lin Yu. At this time, although Lin Yu said he didn't care, he was also panicking in his heart. After waiting for a while, a playful voice suddenly sounded in Lin Yu's ears. Maybe I can help you. When Lin Yu heard this voice, he was suddenly overjoyed. Arya, I knew you had a way. If you have any way, tell me quickly. There are spirit storage pills here. With your current points, you can still redeem 5 of them. The spiritual power of each spirit storage pill is enough to replenish the spiritual power in your body and bring you to your peak state. After Lin Yu heard what Arya said, he was instantly ecstatic. His eyes were fixed on Arya, and the smile at the corner of his mouth changed even more. It became more and more obvious. I knew you must have a way, Arya. If that's the case, then I'll do as you said and exchange it for me for the spiritual storage pill now. After Arya heard what Lin Yu said, she also smiled like this, thank you master for the compliment, the spiritual storage pill will be distributed later. After waiting for a moment, a ray of light flashed, and then suddenly there was an elixir in Lin Yu's palm. At this time, Lin Yu carefully looked at the elixir in his hand. Dan Yao, the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. Yes, yes, this elixir is really good. Lin Yu's face was suddenly overjoyed at that time. And just after this moment, Lin Yu swallowed the pill in his palm into his mouth, and a strong spiritual power swept through his limbs. Lin Yu's face was full of confusion. It was a look of joy, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. After waiting for a while, Lin Yu felt that the spiritual power in his body was more abundant than ever since he entered this place. At this time, the smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. Great, now I can finally deal with this guy with peace of mind. After seeing the scene in the distance, Count Nicholas's face began to look slightly ugly, because he could clearly feel the aura of Lin Yu's body, which began to become more and more obvious. How is it possible? How could the aura of this boy become so abrupt? At this time, the time and space beasts seemed to be able to feel the abundant spiritual power in Lin Yu's body at this moment. The time and space beast at this time screamed so suddenly in Lin Yu's mind. "Hurry up, let me out quickly, I have a way to break this guy's space barrier." After Lin Yu heard what the space-time beast said, the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of excitement. At this time, his expression suddenly washed away, and then he nodded slightly. Lin Yu, just like this, quickly released the space-time beast. At the moment when he was released, the space-time beast immediately activated the teleportation. In just one breath, a surging aura started like this, suddenly emanating from Lin Yu's body. That majestic momentum was precisely Lin Yu's face, and it slowly began to show a hint of joy. After waiting for this moment, a surging force suddenly crashed into the territory of Count Nicholas. After Count Nicholas felt this surging force impacting his field, his face instantly turned ugly. At this time, he only felt a surge of energy in his chest, and then at this moment, after that, a mouthful of blood spurted out. However, this knockdown did not break the realm. The space-time beast and Lin Yu looked at each other with a look of solemnity in their eyes, and Lin Yu's face suddenly condensed. "What's going on now?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the space-time beast, and his brows seemed to be locked together. After this moment, a surging force began to surge out, and the swirling force gathered for a long time, giving people an extremely mysterious feeling. Just after this moment, Lin Yu suddenly opened his eyes, and a golden light flashed in his eyes, and the killing intent on his body was even more awe-inspiring. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed, and Count Nicholas finally couldn't hold it anymore, and a mouthful of blood spurted out directly, and the blood dyed the area red. After this moment, Lin Yu turned his head and glared at Count Nicholas fiercely, and then the white tiger suddenly jumped up and threw Count Nicholas to the ground. The white tiger opened its blood-spraying mouth, and then said in a cold voice, "How dare you plot against me? I'll kill you." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 476. At this time, the white tiger opened its bloody mouth and suddenly swallowed Count Nicholas directly. The white tiger's speed was extremely fast. In just one breath, it had already arrived in front of Count Nicholas. Then, when Count Nicholas saw this scene, his face suddenly sank. He retreated crazily towards the back. But after retreating for a while, he felt as if he was being restrained by an invisible force. His face turned slightly ugly, and he had an ominous premonition in his heart. "You, what do you want to do? I'm warning you, if you dare to mess around, if you dare to mess around." Count Nicholas's voice trembled slightly when he spoke. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Count Nicholas said, a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. "There seems to be nothing I dare not do." After Bai Hu heard what Lin Yu said, the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and then without any hesitation, Bai Hu swallowed Count Nicholas in one gulp. At this time, the white tiger was devouring the food, and the excitement on his face became more and more obvious. At this time, the poor Earl Nicholas was swallowed by the white tiger bite by bite. After waiting for a while, the white tiger also burped like this. Lin Yu's mind moved, and then the white tiger was called back by Lin Yu. After Count Nicholas was killed, Lin Yu just breathed a sigh of relief, but a sense of crisis surged into his heart. A bitter smile appeared on the corners of Lin Yu's lips, and his eyes were full of a kind of helplessness. "Oh, one wave has not subsided, another wave has arisen, it is really a headache, it is really a headache," Lin Yu said helplessly. At this time, Evelyn on the side seemed to have encountered something terrible. She just let out a scream, and then immediately collapsed to the ground, trembling and foaming at the mouth. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he didn't hesitate for a moment and flew to Evelyn's side. At this time, Lin Yu began to examine Evelyn carefully. After waiting for a while, everyone saw that Lin Yu's expression began to become more and more gloomy. And at this moment, a ball of black energy suddenly appeared in the sky above everyone, and the ball of black energy said in a cold voice, "You are very powerful, you can't even kill my most powerful corpse king." The voice began to become more and more gloomy and cold. After everyone heard the voice, they just felt a strong sense of oppression. A hint of gloom flashed across Su Yang's face. "Stop pretending to be a ghost here. If you have the ability, show up as soon as possible. What's the point of hiding in the dark all the time?" At this moment, Su Yang's voice became colder and colder, and the black energy heard it. After Su Yang said this, he didn't seem to be angry at all, but just smiled like this. He is really a very interesting little guy, but you shouldn't be so disrespectful to me." After saying that, the black energy suddenly rushed towards Su Yang. When Lin Yu saw this scene, his face suddenly sank, and then he roared, "Get away!" Su Yang was slightly stunned at first, and then suddenly jumped to the side. At this time, although Su Yang also looked confused, he still did so. And just a moment later, the space where Su Yang was standing was instantly annihilated. When Su Yang saw this scene, he couldn't help but swallow his saliva. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu's face began to look increasingly ugly. That group of black energy, after seeing this scene, just smiled like this, "GGG, I didn't expect you to avoid it." At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on that mass of black energy. His eyes flashed a bit of gloom, and his face showed a coldness, and the murderous intention in his body was here. She also showed it without any reservation. "I want you to die today," Lin Yu said in a cold voice, and the gloomy murderous intention between his eyebrows began to become more and more obvious. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the man in black robe wanted to seize the establishment. He sneered slightly, and then shook his head. "Little guy, you want to kill me? But you have to have some ability, but I don't think you have that ability." The man in black robe just said this unhurriedly. The smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and there was a bit of mockery in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what the black-robed man said, Lin Yu roared in anger, and then suddenly jumped up, swung his fist, and hit the black-robed man hard. In just a breath, Lin Yu came in front of the black-robed man, and then punched the black-robed man in the chest. The black-robed man flew backwards and fell heavily to the ground. Blood spurted out of his mouth and his face turned pale. At this time, Lin Yu slowly walked towards the black-robed man, with a sneer on his lips and a flash of contempt in his eyes. "It seems that you are just like this," Lin Yu said slowly, and the smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the man in black robe clenched his fists and his eyes were full of gloom. At this moment, his eyes were about to spit fire. But just after this moment, the man in black robe actually laughed strangely. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 477. Jajaja, do you really want to see this kind of scene? But I'm afraid I have to say sorry to you, you can't see this kind of scene anymore, ha 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 ha. The man in black robes had a look of madness in his eyes and brows. At this time, he felt as if he was completely crazy. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes and stared at the man in black robes. At this time, a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. "Interesting, it's really interesting. It seems like it's time to give you a good time today." Before the man in black robe could react, Lin Yu was so direct and suddenly rushed in front of the man in black robe. But at this moment, Lin Yu suddenly felt as if the power in his body had been quietly taken away. At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a hint of helplessness. The corner of his mouth also evoked a bit of a wry smile. Why is it like this? Lin Yu's brows seemed to be knitted together. At this moment, he suddenly felt a bit of an ominous premonition in his heart, and his eyes were fixed on the man in black robe. At this time, the man in black robe suddenly smiled. He walked slowly towards Lin Yu and looked down at Lin Yu. "Little guy, do you have anything else to say now?" At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on the man in black robe. His face showed a cold light, and the killing intent on his body was even more awe-inspiring. "When did you plot against me just now?" At this time, the man in black robe transformed into a ball of black energy, and then directly enveloped Lin Yu. At this moment, Su Yang and Su Weiner also looked at each other after seeing this scene. Then the two people summoned their own Tao beasts, one black and one white, and the two rays of light shot straight into the sky and attacked directly towards the man in black robe. At this time, the man in black robe just turned his head and glanced coldly at the two of them. A gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and the killing intent on his body was even more awe-inspiring. And when the two breaths were only 3 inches away from the man in black robes, they heard a loud roar, and then the two people instantly felt a surging force moving towards them. Touching his chest, it rushed out like this. At the end of the day, the two people fell heavily to the ground, and a mouthful of blood spurted out from their mouths. With just a wave of their hands, they became what they are now. At this time, the two of them also began to realize the horror of this black energy. Lin Yu discovered that there seemed to be a specific connection between the man in black robe and the black energy when he was freely switching between them. However, he couldn't quite explain this specific connection, so at this time, his eyes were so straight. He stared intently at the man in black robe. "It's strange. It's really weird. What's going on with this man in black robe?" Lin Yu murmured in a low voice there, and the solemn expression between his eyebrows began to become more and more obvious. At this moment, the man in black robe also had a slight sneer at the corner of his mouth. "Don't think about it. If I want to have a real form, I will have a real form. If I don't have a real body, I will have no real body." Such profound and unpredictable cultivation, how can a kid like you understand this? The man in black robe just said this unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. There was a bit of ridicule in his eyes, and his eyes were straight like this. Gaudi stared at Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu only felt a burst of anger. His fists clenched loudly, and the killing intent in his eyes was even more awe-inspiring. "Really? It's quite majestic." But at this time, Lin Yu was getting more and more angry. The power in him seemed to have disappeared into the sea and could not be summoned by him at all. At this time, Lin Yu's face became increasingly pale. His eyes were fixed on the man in black robes, and his chest was filled with anger and unwillingness. At this time, the man in black robe stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. "Little guy, it seems you can't do anything to me this time." At this time, Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood a little. He glanced coldly at the man in black. "I can't help you?" "I don't think so." Lin Yu almost said this through gritted teeth, but it was obvious that the man in black robe was very contemptuous of Lin Yu's behavior. "I evolved from a ray of Tao Qi when the world first opened, so how do you think you can deal with me? What do you think? Just use whatever skills you have, and see if you can do anything. That's it." The man in black robe just said this unhurriedly, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. The corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a look of madness, and his whole person was filled with madness. He seems to be a complete madman. Although Lin Yu hated the man in black robe with gritted teeth, he had to admit that what the man in black robe said was indeed true. Now he really couldn't do anything about the man in black robe. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, thinking about how he should deal with the black-robed man in front of him next. At this moment, the man in black robe seemed to notice Evelyn in the distance. The man in black robe glanced in Evelyn's direction, and in the corners of his eyes and brows, there was a sense of excitement. "Nix, I didn't expect it was really you." As he spoke, the man in black robe turned into a ball of black mist and rushed towards Evelyn crazily. The man in black robe was extremely fast. In just a blink of an eye, he had already reached Evelyn. Lynn sighed. At this time, Evelyn was wrapped in the black energy, and a kind of fear was completely revealed in the corners of her eyes and brows. At this time, Evelyn was waving her hands desperately and shaking her head. "You, who are you? Get out of here, get out of here." Evelyn was even a bit hysterical at this time, and the black mist that the man in black robe turned into at this time obviously had no intention of letting Evelyn go, just like this, little by little wrapped Evelyn. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 478. And at this moment, the corners of the black-robed man's eyes and brows were filled with a sense of excitement and madness. His eyes were staring straight at Evelyn, and there was a coldness on his body. The momentum has become more and more obvious. "Goddess of beauty, it's really good, it's really good." At this time, the man in black robe was even a little incoherent. His eyes were fixed directly on Evelyn, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. "Stand up." And just after this moment, Evelyn felt that her eyelids were getting heavier and heavier, and then she felt a sense of drowsiness. The drowsy feeling began to become more and more obvious. After waiting for a while, the man in black robe began to laugh more and more wildly. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu couldn't help but flash a few thoughts in the corners of his eyes and brows. Oh, at this moment, her face suddenly turned cold, and then she fell into a deep voice. Speaking to Arya. "What should we do now? Is there any way to deal with this guy?" Arya had a look of embarrassment on her face, and then shook her head. "This guy's identity is very strange. He seems to have never shown up before, so there is no news about him. I'm afraid." Arya paused when she said this. Even if Arya didn't say what was left, Lin Yu could still understand that this time it might not be as easy to solve as he thought. In the past, everything could be saved. But this time it probably won't work. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "So, is there anything you can do to help me now?" Lin Yu just whispered in a leisurely manner. After Arya heard what Lin Yu said, she also had a look of embarrassment on her face. I'm afraid this is really difficult." Lin Yu half squinted his eyes. "What's the problem? Tell me and see if you can think of a way to solve it." Lin Yu also felt a little helpless, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Arya conducted a comprehensive analysis of the black energy. After the analysis, Arya seemed to have discovered something. Kind of excitement. It seems there is nothing we can do." After Lin Yu heard what Arya said, he also showed a look of joy. At this time, his expression was like this, and he suddenly felt happy, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became even brighter. It became obvious. "Then come and tell me, what method do you have to solve this problem now?" Arya just thought for a moment. "There is an ancient beast in the mall called the Sky-Swallowing Beast. If you unlock the Sky-Swallowing Beast, you might be able to subdue the black energy, but..." Arya paused immediately after saying this, with a look of embarrassment on her face. When Lin Yu saw Arya's expression, he knew that the points in the mall were definitely not enough. She also coughed lightly at this time. "Ahem, it doesn't matter. The points in the mall are not enough." "Well, is there any way to get points quickly? Has the mission system been updated recently?" Arya heard Lin Yu say this. After saying this, she glanced at the mission panel in the mall, and then stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of her mouth. After Lin Yu saw Arya like this, he knew that things would probably not be that simple this time. His eyes were fixed on Arya. "Arya, what happened? Why are you looking at me like this? You really make me a little. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, Arya just smiled, and then coughed lightly. Ahem, it's actually nothing, I'm just happy for you. After Lin Yu heard what Arya said, his eyes were full of surprise. At this time, he looked confused, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Be happy for me? What do you mean? Why can't I understand it? System mission, kiss the awakened Aphrodite, and the reward system Mal will randomly select an ancient beast, alien beast, etc., and chaos level. When Lin Yu heard what Arya said, he felt like crying for a while. At this time, his face also darkened slightly, and a hint of helplessness flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. It even evoked a bit of a wry smile. Then, according to your opinion, I have to kiss Aphrodite. After Arya heard Lin Yu say this, she also nodded slightly. At this moment, Lin Yu was also on the verge of crying. Then, is there any other way? Lin Yu just said helplessly, and the bitter smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, that person couldn't help but shook his head slightly. As for other methods, I really don't know at the moment. At present, system tasks are all assigned individually, so if you don't accept it, then I'm afraid. Arya's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and she stopped talking halfway. Lin Yu certainly understood what Arya meant. Okay, okay. At this time, Arya stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face. Then what is your choice now? Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down a little. My choice now is to accept the task. At this time, the black-robed man was madly absorbing the power of Evelyn and Lin Yu. The black-robed man's eyes were full of madness, and the excitement in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows became more and more obvious. Ha ha ha, is this the feeling of power? Is this the feeling of power? It's so wonderful, so wonderful. At this time, the black-robed man was even a little incoherent. Lin Yu heard it, and after the black-robed man said this, his heart was also full of anger. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 479. But at this time, no matter how much Lin Yu wanted to break free, it was still useless. Although Lin Yu was full of anger and unwillingness, he had no way. At this time, Lin Yu took a deep breath and then calmed down his mood. Lin Yu slowly turned his head and looked at Evelyn. At this moment, Evelyn was falling into a deep sleep. The silent power made everyone feel the horror. At this time, Lin Yu half closed his eyes, his face was slightly condensed, and a bit of helplessness flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and a bit of bitter smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. What should I do now? Lin Yu had no idea how he could break free from the control of this guy. The black-robed man turned into a ball of black air, and whispered in their ears, you two have no chance of turning the tables, so just let me swallow you up. This is your best ending. After the black-robed man said this, he laughed loudly. There was a kind of madness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and the murderous intent on his body was even more stern. A cold aura gushed out from the black-robed man so madly, and the cold aura swept directly towards them. It was only a moment, and it had already arrived in front of them. At this moment, Evelyn only felt that her whole body seemed to be falling rapidly into the endless abyss. Evelyn's heart trembled slightly, and she had a bit of ominous premonition in her heart. What's going on with me? At this moment, Evelyn felt that in the darkness of the endless abyss, there seemed to be a ball of light lingering around her. After Evelyn saw this scene, there was a bit of joy in her eyes, and then she slowly walked towards the ball of light. After waiting for this moment, Evelyn gently touched the ball of light. When he touched that little bit of light, The endless breath of light directly enveloped Evelyn. At this time, Evelyn's body exuded a soft white light, and that soft white light directly dispelled the black air completely. At this time, Lin Yu also took the opportunity to get rid of the restraints of the black-robed man, and then suddenly rushed towards Evelyn. Lin Yu hugged Evelyn, gritted his teeth, and then kissed her. At this time, Aphrodite instantly opened her eyes, and a cold feeling swept across Lin Yu's back. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly had a few ominous premonitions in his heart. After a while, Lin Yubian felt a pain in his chest, and then a slender hand grabbed Lin Yubian's neck. At this time, Lin Yubian felt that his neck was restrained, and even breathing was a little difficult. Aphrodite's eyes flashed a bit of gloom, and the murderous intent on her body was revealed at this time. "Boy, you dare to offend your god, I think you are simply looking for death." Aphrodite's voice was quite gloomy, and at this time, after hearing what Aphrodite said, Lin Yu spread his hands helplessly, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Believe me, I have my reasons for doing this," Lin Yu said softly, and Aphrodite's eyes stared at Lin Yu, and a cold murderous intent spread from Aphrodite's body. "Tell me, what are your reasons?" At this moment, the black air on the side was about to succeed, but now it almost failed. The black air was naturally full of dissatisfaction and unwillingness. "Asshole, I didn't expect you to dare to do this, it's just courting death." At this time, Lin Yu heard the black air, and after saying this, his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together, and there was a bit of gloom in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and the murderous intent on his body was even more stern. After waiting for a while, Aphrodite seemed to notice the black air. At this time, Aphrodite directly threw Lin Yu aside. She slowly turned her head, and just glanced coldly at the black air, her eyes full of a gloomy color. "Just now you plotted against me, right?" Aphrodite said in a cold voice. At this time, after hearing what Aphrodite said, the black gas also laughed loudly. His eyes were fixed on Aphrodite, and then he waved his hand lightly. "So what if it is, so what if it is not? What if I plot against you?" the black-robed man said in a cold voice. Aphrodite, after hearing what the black-robed man said, the murderous intent on her body rose even more. A cold and violent aura, that cold and violent aura made people feel a little uneasy and restless. After waiting for this moment, a gloomy and dark atmosphere quietly emerged in the void. The man in black robe just glanced at the two of them coldly, his eyes full of a kind of contempt. "Forget it, I'm too lazy to continue playing like this with you two. I wish you good luck and I'll leave first." After the man in black robe finished speaking, he disappeared directly in front of the two of them. Just a moment later, the man in black robe disappeared without a trace. Lin Yu never expected that after seeing the two of them, the black energy didn't even have the slightest intention to fight. At this time, Lin Yu had a hint of helplessness in his eyes, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He shook his head helplessly. "I really don't know what this guy is doing. It's so weird." A gloomy aura enveloped Lin Yu's back. At this moment, Lin Yu's face was suddenly startled after feeling the gloomy aura. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 480. Lin Yu turned his head slowly, and then he saw a pair of light blue eyes. The eyes were as crystal clear as sapphires, but at this moment, there was infinite anger in them. "I'm going to kill you." An angry roar suddenly came to mind. At this time, after Lin Yu heard the angry roar, a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness. "Color. Don't be like this, you listen to my explanation, you listen to my explanation." At this time, Lin Yu was even a little incoherent. It was obvious that Aphrodite had no intention of listening to Lin Yu's explanation. "You actually dare to offend me? No matter what you say today, it will be useless." I will definitely kill you, I swear. Aphrodite said this through gritted teeth, and then suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu. His speed was extremely fast, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in front of Lin Yu. Don't be like this. In fact, I was just trying to save both of our lives. At this time, Aphrodite's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Boy, do you think I will believe you? Aphrodite suddenly rushed towards Lin Yu, and then she grabbed Lin Yu's neck. At this time, Lin Yu knew that he was in the wrong and did not dare to resist too violently, so he resignedly allowed Aphrodite to grab his neck. After a while, Aphrodite seemed to have remembered something. At this time, above the void, a shield slowly unfolded. There was a special symbol on the shield. At this time, Aphrodite's face condensed slightly, and something flashed in the corner of her eyes and eyebrows. A bit solemn. Aphrodite half closed her eyes, and then suddenly threw Lin Yu heavily to the ground. At this time, Lin Yu felt a surge in his chest. Surge. After waiting for a while, he also coughed violently. Ahem, cough, cough, I said, can't you, a woman, be more gentle? At this moment, Aphrodite ignored Lin Yu. You are lucky today, but don't let me meet you next time. If you dare to offend the goddess, I think you are simply impatient. Aphrodite said coldly. At this time, Lin Yu just turned his head to the side and whispered softly, you are such a fierce woman, who wants to treat you like before? You want to be beautiful. Aphrodite seemed to have heard what Lin Yu said. She just glared coldly at Lin Yu, with a completely gloomy look in the corners of her eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu was also very sensible. He closed his mouth and said no more. After waiting for a while, looking at Aphrodite, she just sighed quietly, with a solemn expression in the corners of her eyes and brows. Oh, it seems that there is really nothing we can do this time. In this case, we can only act with caution for the time being. After Aphrodite finished speaking, she disappeared directly in front of Lin Yu. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Aphrodite's back. In the ancient battlefield of gods, it stands to reason that these ancient gods should have fallen, but why did Aphrodite suddenly awaken? Is this a conspiracy? When Lin Yu thought of this, his face suddenly became ugly. At this time, his expression condensed slightly, and a look of disbelief flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. After waiting for a while, Lin Yu seemed to have remembered something. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a strange color flashed in his eyes. Interesting, it seems like this thing is getting more and more interesting. I don't know how much time passed before Su Yang and Su Weiner slowly woke up. At this time, Su Yang and Su Weiner were staring directly at Lin Yu, with a bit of confusion in the corners of their eyes and brows. What happened to the two of us? Su Yang and Su Weiner's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu just turned his head and glanced at Su Yang and Su Weiner. No, it's nothing, it's just that you two just passed out, don't worry. Lin Yu stared at the two of them with a smile on his face. At this time, Su Yang and Su Weiner were looking at each other in confusion. They seemed to feel that something was wrong, but they couldn't explain exactly what was wrong. Lin Yu slowly stood up and glanced at the two of them. It's getting late, it seems we should leave. Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly, and at this time, Su Yang and Su Weiner were looking at each other. Then, Su Yang and Su Weiner became confused and fell to their knees on the ground. After Lin Yu saw the scene at this time, his expression was slightly condensed, and there was a bit of confusion in his eyes. What are you two doing? Get up, get up. At this time, Su Yang and Su Weiner didn't even move. After seeing them like this, Lin Yu was also confused. Why are you two like this? Just tell me what you want to do, don't do this. Lin Yu stared at Su Yang and Su Weiner, and a little confusion flashed in his eyes. At this time, Su Weiner suddenly said, please save my sect. Lin Yu's face was also slightly startled, and a little curiosity flashed in his eyes. Savior sect? What's going on? Tell me in detail. After hearing what Lin Yu said, Su Yang and Su Wan'er were delighted. So, sir, do you agree? Lin Yu just coughed lightly. Ahem, I didn't say anything, but I'm curious about what you just said. Tell me in detail. If I can help, I will definitely not stand idly by.